figure of an Egyptian pharaoh, an absolute ruler who held complete authority over his people. The concept of absolute rule was strongly developed among kings of ancient times. With the rise of the Roman Empire, the concept of absolutism was continued in Western Europe in a long line of Roman emperors. In time, the emperors assumed divinity. They were not only rulers, but gods. This idea of the rulers being set apart from other men continued for centuries. And we see it, for example, in the crowning of Charlemagne in 800 AD. Consecration by the Pope stamped the seal of divine grace on the ruler. He was an absolute monarch ruling by divine right. The concept of the king receiving his right to rule from God is illustrated in the reign of James I of England in the late 16th century. "Kings," said James, "are God's lieutenants and sit upon God's throne." And again he said, "Kings have the power of raising and casting down, of life and death, are judges over all their subjects, and accountable to none but God only." But to see absolutism at its height, we turn to France, to the great palace at Versailles. Versailles Palace was built by the king whose statue still dominates the scene, Louis XIV of France. In his long reign of 72 years, Louis, the Grand Monarch, raised the French throne and absolutism to its height. His power stemmed from earlier French kings, such as Philip Augustus, who by 1200 had consolidated the royal power at the expense of the feudal nobles. By 1600, Henry IV had established the House of Bourbon in France. Henry IV and his son Louis XIII were the first kings of what we may consider as modern France. Young Louis XIV, seen in this flattering idealized painting, was far from being an absolute monarch when he was crowned in 1654. His power was threatened by rebellious subjects who waged civil war. Rebels tried to hold the king prisoner, and young Louis was forced to flee Paris. Louis had learned two lessons: never let the power of any noble equal his own, and never live where his subjects might take him prisoner. After the rebellion failed, Louis began construction of a splendid seat of royal government outside Paris at Versailles. We see the palace as it was in 1668. Here the king induced his nobles to live with him, under his eye and in his power. The wealth for this came from the country that Louis XIV had inherited from his fathers. France was rich in natural resources and had the largest population of any nation in Europe in the 17th century. There were still feudal fortresses from which powerful French nobles had defied earlier French kings. But they were disappearing. Many feudal strongholds had been destroyed under the direction of Cardinal Richelieu. As chief minister of Louis XIII, Richelieu had greatly strengthened the royal power. Richelieu's successor was Cardinal Mazarin. As first minister for the young Louis XIV, Mazarin dominated both king and the French nation for nearly 20 years. In 1661, Louis XIV announced he would be his own first minister. He had learned another lesson: a king must rule, not be ruled. Of course, he would still need advisors. Chief of these was Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Colbert was the financial genius who strengthened the French economy, raising the money that made possible the magnificent palace of Versailles. Now, in the last quarter of the 17th century, it has taken 21 years to complete and stands as a superb monument to the Grand Monarch, Louis XIV. To Versailles, Day and night, riders bring news and reports of the affairs of state to the king. This courier brings reports from the French army on the Netherlands border. As he enters the palace, the courier walks through vast galleries and rooms. His arrival may be watched with interest by some of the hundreds of people who live at Louis XIV's court, most of them members of the aristocracy. Many are nobles who no longer live on their estates. It is the fashion to live at court. In a way, they're like captives. Having little power now, they while away time and spend great sums of money to stay at court, where they may be near the king. They must stay, for only the king can grant advancement, wealth, honors. This young noble would like to command a regiment. The army is one of the few careers still open to nobles. News, rumors, and small talk relieve the boredom of court life. Along with the aristocrats, living a life of leisure, there are others at court. The military is represented by such figures as this Marshal of France. He will command an army if there is war, but under the king's personal supervision. Bishops and other clergymen also live at the court, representing the church that sanctions the monarchy. A minister brings news. A courier has arrived with a military report from the Netherlands. The marshal will convey the report to the king, who personally supervises everything pertaining to the government. In his self-appointed task of absolute ruler, Louis XIV prides himself on keeping informed of all matters and deciding upon every detail of government. His ministers do not come from the first or second estates, the clergy or nobility, as they did under former kings. These men are from the third estate, lawyers or bankers, chosen for their experience and ability. War accounts for some of the enormous amounts the government spends, amounts furnished by constantly increasing taxes. Only the king has the power to tax France now. Besides the officials at Versailles, the royal government is administered by local officials called intendants. The intendants, responsible directly to the king, administer the districts into which France is now divided. France's military power has been gained by a series of wars of aggression of the king. In these exploits, the king often played a personal role. Yet, by the end of his reign, Louis XIV, even though skillful in picking good generals, had lost as much as he had won. Whatever his defects, the king's great ability for hard work and his obsession with ruling personally and absolutely kept France strong throughout his reign. His ministers, the whole structure of his government, are simply the instruments of his will. In his few leisure hours, he turns to entertainment and the arts. Here, too, he is absolute. The king's taste is the standard for his time. He may study architect's sketches for additions to his palace of Versailles, or designs for the ballets or operas he presents to amuse his court and foreign visitors. Books interest the king very little. He almost never reads. But he writes. He writes instructions for his successors, a book on the profession of a king. His long reign has not been as successful as he had hoped. The profession of an absolute monarch is an extremely difficult one. Even though this flattering portrait shows him as the supremely confident and regal monarch, his rule led to bankruptcy for France. Near the end of his life, he wrote to his heir, "Do not imitate my love for building and for war, but assuage the misery of my people." Louis's successor, Louis XV, was not the king to fill the role of an absolute monarch. Still, other European kings looked upon absolutism as a model to be copied. Frederick the Great of Prussia was another absolute monarch who ruled a powerful military state. Like Louis XIV, Frederick supervised all things in his domain personally and absolutely. In Russia, Tsar Peter I was another of the European monarchs who imitated the Grand Monarch. Tsar Peter, too, created a court like Versailles in St. Petersburg, from which he imposed absolute rule on his subjects. The last Tsar, Nicholas II, was a victim of the Russian Revolution of 1917. In that same period of World War I, Austria was ruled by Francis Joseph, one of the last absolute monarchs of modern times. His great palace of Schonbrunn in Vienna, which housed generations of Austrian monarchs, was one of many 18th century palaces built in imitation of Versailles. The palace is a present-day reminder of the Grand Monarch, Louis XIV of France, whose reign of 72 years left an indelible mark on the history of Europe.